Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are looking at a collision of two massive worldviews. And honestly, the stakes couldn't be higher. We're talking about the universe, morality, history, and, ultimately whether we are alone in the cosmos or part of some grand design.
It is a fundamental clash. We're revisiting a debate held at the University of Notre Dame that I think just perfectly encapsulates this modern struggle between faith and skepticism.
Right.
The motion was, is religion the problem? But frankly, that was just the appetizer.
It really was, because once these two got going, they weren't just arguing about politics, they were arguing about, well, everything. In one corner, you have the late Christopher Hitchens. I've read some of his stuff. The guy had a way with words that could cut glass, a fiercely anti-theist writer.
He really did.
He thought religion was not just wrong, but actually dangerous.
And in the other corner, Dinesh D'Souza. He is a prominent conservative thinker, a Christian apologist, who takes a very different approach than, the old school fire and brimstone preachers.
Yeah.
He doesn't just quote scripture. He tries to use science and history to prove that belief is actually the more rational choice.
So it's the ultimate showdown, the believer versus the skeptic. And before we get into the heavy stuff, and trust me, it gets heavy, I just want to say, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It really helps us keep these deep dives coming. All right, so where do we even begin with a topic this huge?
Well, D'Souza makes a really smart move right out of the gate. He knows his audience. He's at a university. He's debating Hitchens. So he says, I'm not going to argue from revelation.
Meaning he's not just going to say, because the Bible says so.
Exactly. He wants to argue from reason. And he starts with what he calls a presuppositional argument, using a detective analogy.
A detective, you mean like Sherlock Holmes?
A similar idea, yeah. Imagine a detective at a crime scene.
Okay.
All the physical evidence points to one specific suspect, but that suspect has a solid alibi. He was seen somewhere else.
So the facts don't fit.
The facts don't fit the theory. The detective is stuck until he presupposes the existence of an accomplice.
An accomplice he can't see.
Right. He can't see him, but assuming the accomplice exists suddenly makes all the confusing evidence just fall into place.
Okay, I think I follow. So he's saying the universe is the crime scene, and the facts don't make sense unless you assume there's an accomplice.
Precisely. D'Souza argues that the accomplice is God. You can't see him directly. But his existence explains the messy facts of reality better than atheism does. He even draws a parallel to modern physics.
To physics. How?
Dark matter.
I've heard of dark matter, but I usually think of it as a sci-fi thing. How does that relate to God?
Well, scientists observe how galaxies spin. Based on the visible matter, stars, gas, all that stuff, there isn't enough gravity to hold them together.
So they should be flying apart.
They should be, but they aren't. So scientists assume there must be some invisible stuff providing the extra gravity. They call it dark matter.
They've never seen it, but they assume it's there.
Because it explains the effects they can see. D'Souza says God is the dark matter of the universe.
That's actually a pretty clever way to frame it. But what is the gravity in this analogy? What's the evidence that needs explaining?
The main one he leans on is the fine-tuning of the universe. It's often called the anthropic principle.
I've heard that term thrown around, but I've never really understood what it means.
Think of the universe as a giant control board with dozens of dials. These dials are the fundamental constants of nature. The strength of gravity, the speed of light, the rate of expansion.
All the basic rules.
Right. And D'Souza points out that these dials are set to incredibly precise numbers. If you turn the gravity dial just a tiny bit to the right, stars would burn out in 1,000,000 years. No life.
And to the left?
Turn it a hair to the left, stars wouldn't even form. The universe would just be cold gas.
So it's like the universe hit the lottery, a cosmic lottery.
D'Souza would say it's more than a lottery. I mean, he quotes Stephen Hawking, who said that if the rate of expansion after the Big Bang had been different by 1 part in 100,000 million,
That's an insane number.
the universe would have just collapsed back on itself. So D'Souza looks at those odds and asks, is that a lucky accident? Or did someone set the dials?
Okay, that is a compelling argument. It makes the universe sound like a custom-built home. But I'm guessing Hitchens didn't just sit there and nod along.
Not at all. No. Hitchens hears this whole detective story and just flips the script entirely.
Oh.
He doesn't see a universe designed for us. He sees a chaotic, dangerous mess. He argues that if you actually look at the universe without religious goggles, it looks exactly like what you'd expect if there was no supervisor.
So how does he explain the dials then, the fine-tuning?
He focuses less on the physics numbers and more on the reality of our environment. He calls it the bad design argument.
Bad design.
For instance, he points out that the universe is expanding and accelerating. We're hurtling towards a heat death where everything freezes. And, closer to home, the Andromeda Galaxy is on a direct collision course with us.
Yeah, nothing says good planning like a galactic car crash.
Right. And he gets even more specific with biology. Hitchens reminds everyone that 99.8% of all species that have ever lived on Earth are now extinct.
99.8%.
It's an incredible number. And he asks what kind of designer creates a system that requires that much death and waste just to get to us. He says if there is a designer, he seems incredibly indifferent, maybe even cruel.
That number is staggering. It does make the perfect plan sound a bit inefficient.
And then he attacks the whole "we are made in God's image" idea by looking at our own anatomy. Hitchens calls us an imperfectly evolved primate species.
I've heard that.
We're half a chromosome away from chimpanzees. We have adrenaline glands that are too big, making us aggressive, and frontal lobes that are too small, making us bad at long-term planning.
So we look more like an animal that's just barely scraping by.
Exactly. Not a divine, perfect creation.
It's a very different picture. D'Souza sees a fine-tuned machine. Hitchens sees a crumbling house.
That's a great way to put it. And the debate didn't stay in outer space, of course. They moved on to how we treat each other.
Morality.
Yes. And this is often considered the strongest territory for the theist arguments. Segment 2, the moral landscape. D'Souza poses a very difficult challenge to the atheist worldview.
Which is?
If we're just evolved animals, why are we altruistic?
Well, doesn't evolution explain that? I'm nice to you, so you're nice to me. Reciprocal altruism.
Evolution explains that very well. It explains selfishness, survival of the fittest. It explains kinship, saving your children to pass on your genes.
And scratching each other's backs.
And scratching each other's backs, yes.
Yeah.
But D'Souza argues it fails to explain radical altruism.
Radical altruism. You mean like jumping on a grenade for your friends?
Exactly. Or even something simpler. Giving up your seat on a bus to an old lady you will never see again. Donating blood to a stranger.
There's no genetic benefit there.
None. There's no payback. In a purely survival of the fittest world, that behavior is just a waste of energy. D'Souza calls this the impartial spectator.
The impartial spectator. Sounds like a judge.
It's a concept from Adam Smith, actually. It's that internal voice, your conscience, that tells you what is right, even when it doesn't benefit you personally.
And D'Souza's point is?
That this voice is evidence of a moral lawgiver, someone who wrote a moral code into the fabric of the universe and into us.
That is a tough one. Because if we are just dancing to our DNA, as Richard Dawkins might say, why do we feel bad when we lie to a stranger? Does Hitchens have an answer for that?
He does. Hitchens just refuses to accept that you need a celestial permission slip to be a good person.
He rejects the whole premise?
Completely. He says morality doesn't come from religion at all. And he uses a historical example, Socrates.
Socrates. He was way before Jesus, right?
Centuries before. Hitchens points out that Socrates was debating justice, truth, and the good life long before Christianity even existed. He didn't need a resurrection to figure out that harming others was wrong.
So Hitchens thinks morality is just innate to us as social animals.
Precisely. We need each other to survive, so we evolved empathy. It's built in.
So he thinks religion is just taking credit for something we already had?
Worse than that. He thinks religion actually held us back. He uses this incredibly vivid analogy. He calls it the Mad Blind Guide.
Okay, that sounds like a horror movie title. What's the analogy?
He says, imagine early humanity is lost in a dark, terrifying forest. We're scared, we don't know where we are. In that situation, finding a guide, even if he's mad and blind, might be comforting.
You'd take any help you can get.
You would. He can tap his cane, maybe he knows the path by feel. That was religion in the Bronze Age. It was our first attempt at psychiatry, at healthcare, at explaining the world.
But you wouldn't keep the blind guide forever.
That's his point. He says now the sun has come up. The sun is the Enlightenment, science, germ theory, astronomy. Hitchens argues it's foolish to keep following the Mad Blind Guide when we can finally see for ourselves.
So religion was a first attempt.
But the worst attempt, in his view, because it asserted total certainty when it actually knew nothing.
I can see why the audience was on the edge of their seats. You have D'Souza saying our conscience proves God, and Hitchens saying our conscience exists despite religion.
Exactly.
Which, speaking of conscience, leads to maybe the darkest part of the conversation, the body count.
This is where the gloves really come off.
Yeah.
If we're judging these worldviews by their consequences, you have to look at history. And D'Souza comes out swinging.
He pushes back on the idea that religion causes all the wars.
He does. He argues that things like the Crusades or the Inquisition are just a drop in the bucket compared to what happens when you remove God from the equation.
And he's talking about the 20th century.
The atheist regimes of the 20th century. He lists Stalin in Russia, Mao in China, Pol Pot in Cambodia.
And those are definitely not religious regimes.
They were explicitly state atheists.
Right.
They banned religion, tore down churches, killed priests. And D'Souza cites a death toll of around 100 million people under those dictatorships.
100 million. It's a number that's hard to even wrap your head around.
His argument is basically, look what happens when you decide there is no God and men try to create a utopia on Earth. You get oceans of blood.
So how does he compare that to something like the Inquisition?
He actually crunches the numbers. D'Souza claims that over 350 years, the Spanish Inquisition executed fewer than 2,000 people. He's saying, you atheists complain about religious violence, but secular violence is a monster by comparison.
That really puts Hitchens in a tight spot. I mean, he can't deny that Stalin was an atheist, so how does he handle that?
This is one of Hitchens' most famous arguments. He refuses to accept the premise that these totalitarians were secular in any meaningful way.
Wait, how can an atheist regime be a theocracy? That sounds like a contradiction.
Hitchens asks us to look at the structure, not the label. Look at North Korea today. You have a supreme leader. He is infallible. You cannot question him. You must love him more than your own family.
Everything you have comes from him.
It's a celestial dictatorship brought down to Earth.
I see. So he's saying Stalin and Kim Jong-un just replaced God with the state, or the leader.
Exactly. Hitchens calls it a supreme leader ideology.
Right.
He argues the problem isn't the specific God you worship, but the mindset of absolute submission and faith. He points out the Nazis had Gott mit uns, God with us, on their belt buckles.
So religion teaches a way of thinking that dictators can then exploit.
That's his argument. It teaches you to suspend critical thinking, which paves the way for totalitarians.
So D'Souza says the violence happened because they lacked God's moral law.
And Hitchens says the violence happened because they mimicked the very worst parts of religious structures.
Wow, what a clash. We've covered the universe, morality, the bloody history books. But in the final stretch, they circle back to the very beginning.
The origin of everything. D'Souza brings up a really interesting historical point here about creation ex nihilo.
Creation from nothing.
Yes. He points out that almost all ancient religions had creation myths, where a god shapes the world out of something that's already there. Mud, water, the body of a dead giant.
Right.
But the ancient Hebrews were unique. They proposed that the universe came from absolutely nothing.
And D'Souza sees a connection to modern science there.
He does. He says, hey, that sounds exactly like the Big Bang. Space and time had a beginning. They came from nothing. He argues the Hebrews got this one specific cosmological fact right when everyone else got it wrong.
So he sees that as a kind of validation.
A validation of their divine insight.
That's fascinating. I usually hear people say the Big Bang disproves the Bible, but he's flipping it.
Hitchens, however, leans on quantum physics to counter this. He cites physicists like Lawrence Krauss, arguing that our definition of nothing is wrong.
How so?
In quantum theory, nothing isn't empty. It's actually highly unstable. It weighs something. Virtual particles pop in and out of existence all the time.
So you don't need a deity to push the button.
The laws of physics might just allow for a universe to arise from a vacuum, spontaneously.
And Hitchens has his own take on the mud idea too, right? Something about stardust.
It's one of his more poetic moments. D'Souza believes God breathed life into the dust of the earth. Hitchens counters that the scientific truth is actually more magical. He talks about stellar nucleosynthesis.
Whoa, big word alert. Break that down for us.
It just means that the heavy elements, the carbon in our cells, the iron in our blood, the oxygen we breathe, all of it was forged inside the cores of massive stars.
So we're made of star stuff.
Exactly. When those stars exploded as supernovas, they scattered that material across the galaxy. It eventually formed Earth and us. Hitchens says stars had to die so that we could live.
That is beautiful. It gives you connection to the cosmos without needing a supernatural element.
It does. And this all leads to their closing arguments, which I like to call the existential wager.
The final bit.
D'Souza admits that reason has its limits. He uses an analogy about marriage. Imagine you're dating someone. You have data, you know them, you like them, but you don't have all the data.
Right, you don't know what will happen in 10 years. If you waited for 100% proof a marriage would work, you'd never get married.
Precisely. You'd die alone. D'Souza argues that faith bridges that gap between the limited knowledge we have and the necessity of acting. Life requires a leap.
You bet on the meaning.
You bet on the relationship with God because the alternative is paralysis.
And Hitchens, does he take that bet?
He doubles down on the importance of living without false comforts. He rejects what he calls the bribe of heaven. In fact, he paints the afterlife as a nightmare.
A nightmare.
He asks the audience, do you really want a celestial North Korea? A place where you're under constant surveillance, even your private thoughts, forever, where you can never die, never escape, and must praise the leader for eternity.
Put like that, it does sound exhausting.
So Hitchens finds meaning in solidarity and stoicism. He brings it back to the blood donation example. He says he gets pleasure from giving blood, not because he thinks it buys him a ticket to paradise.
But because of the human connection.
Yes. He argues that doing the right thing when you know there's no reward and no supervisor is actually more moral than doing it because you're afraid of hell.
It's the difference between doing good because it's right and doing good because you're being watched.
That's it perfectly. Hitchens challenges the listener to have the courage to face the void, to accept that we're lucky accidents, and to make our own meaning.
So after all that sparring, where does this leave us? We have two completely different lenses to view the world.
On one side, D'Souza offers a universe that is a home. It was designed for us. The math of the cosmos, the moral law in our hearts, it's all a message from a creator.
It offers purpose, a sense that justice will eventually be served.
And on the other side, Hitchens offers a universe that is a thrilling, dangerous adventure. We're evolved primates on a spinning rock. There is no script, no safety net.
But because of that, our freedom is real and our choices matter more, because this is the only life we get.
It leaves us with a provocative final thought. Hitchens challenges us to reject the celestial dictatorship and grow up. But D'Souza challenges us to explain the impartial spectator, that voice of good inside us.
That really is the sticking point. If there is no designer, why do we feel such a strong obligation to be good to strangers?
But if there is a designer, why is the universe so hostile and full of extinction?
It's a paradox that has kept philosophers up at night for thousands of years.
And the value of this deep dive isn't to declare a winner. It's to force you to examine your own presuppositions. Are you the detective assuming a suspect, or are you the primate trying to make sense of the stars?
I think that is the perfect place to leave it. We can't solve the riddle of existence in 20 minutes, but we can certainly think deeper about it. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
Until next time.